So welcome, thank you for joining. Delighted to have you here today. I'm Sarah Oliver Scemla. I'm legal counsel at Bank of America, where I also set up pro bono program and co-head the program today. I'm also on the steering committee of the in-house pro bono group, along with some of the other attendees today. And I think there's some people who are new to the in-house pro bono group. So very briefly, do join us on LinkedIn and do email us to join our distribution list so you can find out more about what we do. We have a roundtable next week on the 7th of October in the afternoon, which is the perfect time to join the in-house pro bono group and find out more about the in-house pro bono community. Now, without further ado, I'll pass over to Ellie. Ellie is Director of the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative and Senior Associate at MinterEllison, and Ben is Facilitator and Project Coordinator of a number of projects, including the Chancery project, which we'll talk about today. I can't speak, I've been working with Ellie and Ben for since the beginning of the year, I think, and I can't speak highly enough of them and the Chancery project. It's a really wonderful initiative, very effective and very engaging way for lawyers to tackle climate change. So I'll hand over to Ellie now to talk about climate change and how it impacts business, and then Ben will talk about the Chancery project in more detail. Ellie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction. Let me see, how are we going with sharing slides? You can see me and my full screen slide. Terrific. Thank you very much to Sarah and the team at the UK in-house pro bono group for the invitation today to speak to you about something that someone was saying to me recently, when did you get passionate about climate? But actually it's not really something that I would say I'm passionate about. I'm here in survival mode, but I'm here as a corporate lawyer. And I'm here to talk to you about climate change and what it means for your business. I've called it why GCs must be in the C-suite. And so this is a little reference to something that Matt Gingell, our founder and chair of the Chancery project, has been an idea he's been pushing out there. The C-suite isn't just the executive suite. I'm not saying that you are not already there already, but it's the climate suite. So why climate matters for you as executive management, as boards, and as general counsels. And as part of this today, we'll be looking at climate change through a financial and liability lens, which will hopefully set us up for a discussion then around that opportunity and value creation and solutions focused ideas. So I'm going to start talking about money and risk and liability and all of that kind of hard edge of the wedge, and then we'll hopefully be able to have a good discussion around solutions, because that's ultimately what we're here for, is managing risk, integrating it into your strategy, but also to be part of the solutions as individuals, as professionals, as lawyers. I won't really focus anymore on the introduction. I'm a lawyer, I wear multiple hats, and one of those is with the Chancery project, and that's how I know Sarah and Ben and a bunch of the rest of you. And that's probably my favourite hat to wear, because it's focused on solutions. But where are we going to go today? It's just a briefing really around what climate change means to business, and particularly what it means for you in your legal roles. It's really just the start. So I've got a 3-quarter roadmap. I'm not going to be teaching you, be talking about everything we need to know. It's really just a taster and overview. We'll start with the evolution of climate change from an ethical issue to one that presents foreseeable financial risks over mainstream investment horizons. I'm going to give you a bit of a taxonomy, a way to think about these risks and opportunities. So that's the physical, the transition, and the liability risks. So you'll have the language to really engage in these issues in your own role. Then we're going to move to so what, and the so what for regulator and investor expectations. And then just a first kind of pass at some issues for you in your roles as GCs. I'm going to talk a lot about money, risk, and liability, but hopefully we'll pick up some opportunity, value creation, and climate solutions throughout as well. So let's get started. It might have been a little while since you were in school. It certainly has for me. And so I spent a bit of time thinking about what is climate change. And I'm sure you all know what it is, but it's good to just get on the same page about it. The threshold question, when we talk about it, global warming, climate change, what do we mean? We mean the greenhouse effect. So we have a layer of greenhouse gases that are around that are in the atmosphere, and we need them. They trap in heat, and if we didn't have them, we'd be stuck in a horrendous ice age. But we have too much of them at the moment because our human activities, so burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas, methane from the cows that we eat, the burping and farting of cows, and land use clearing. We have more now, more of these greenhouse gases in our atmosphere than we've had in a very long time. You can see that graph. Look at all the blue. That's a safe and stable climate. And then we're now up to over 400 parts per million. What does that do? Well, the greenhouse effect is just like having a bigger blanket on. So at the moment, our blanket is thicker than it has been in hundreds of thousands of years. So that means that we have a warmer planet. So climate change is already here. This is about as deep a science I'm going to get today. So this is the distribution curve, and these are normal temperatures. And you can see that around 100 years ago, it was all pretty stable around the average, and it had been for a long time. Now this is what it looks like. So climate change, the global warming is already here. We've shifted, the graph has shifted to the left. So the average temperature is now over 1 degree warmer than it was in pre-industrial times, and that safe and stable climate that we've had throughout our human civilization and flourishing. So now we're at an average 1 degree warmer. And we also have, you can see that the graph shifted. Look at these fat tails, and it's shifted a lot to the right. And with fat tails, we get risk and we get uncertainty. So now there's a refresher on what climate change is. What does it mean for business? Well, we've gone from climate being this kind of ethical or environmental issue to one that squarely presents financial risks and opportunities throughout mainstream horizons. How do we know that? Well, the World Economic Forum, every year when they're in, just before they get to Davos, and they make snow angels in their money, they consult on what are the top risks in terms of likelihood and impact. And you can see that this year's global risk report, environmental and nature related and climate risks are keeping executives up at night. The top 5 risks in terms of likelihood and impact over the next 10 years, they're all those green diamonds up in that top right corner. And you can see that they are much higher than cyber attacks. That's there. So if you're thinking, how much time as a general counsel should I be thinking about these risks? Are you spending 5 times more than cyber attacks, 6 times more if we add in water crises? That's just a little heuristic for you to know that this should be on your agenda. Okay, so we've got some animations there. So how do we think about climate risks? Fortunately, back in 2015, the Bank of England, PRA, gave us a taxonomy, a way to think about the transmission pathways of these risks, how they affect entities, and then at a magnitude, how they affect financial stability. And we have this climate risk taxonomy: physical risks, transition risks, and liability risks. So the physical risks are they come from the gradual onset changes, like the warming temperature, the ocean acidification, the sea level rise, also from the increase in frequency and severity of extreme weather events like wildfires, drought, and rain events, and also the ecological impacts, so the species loss that we have and other impacts. Then from that, we have society's responses, in particularly the market responses, which are driven by policy and regulation, technology, and the other kind of stakeholder responses to these physical risks. Then from both the physical and the transition risks, we get liability risks. So you could be sued. So they come from a failure to mitigate, adapt, or disclose the physical or transition risks. And so when we're talking, most of today, when I'm talking about climate change in business, I'm going to be talking about the risks to the profits of the company or institution, and not the impact of the company on the institution. That does create risks, but indirectly, for example, through a carbon price. They are far-reaching in their breadth and magnitude across the economy. They manifest within mainstream investment horizons. But some work that the Bank of England gave us in 2018, a Transition in Thinking paper, showed that actually the difference between these and other financial risk issues is that the decisions that we make today will determine the magnitude of these risks in the future, which is quite different to normal kinds of risks that then manifest in credit operational strategic risks in that way. So they're the same, but they're different. And so sectors such as the fossil fuel extraction, combustion, chemicals and manufacturing, transport, real estate and agriculture and financial services are particularly vulnerable, but they do manifest across all sectors of the economy. So you are being told by the Bank of England not to hug a tree, but to manage your risk. Let's go into a little bit more detail about what these risks are. So we'll start with the physical risks. Climate change is a threat multiplier. So I've got a map here of the UK, and in a lot of ways the UK is in some ways protected from climate change in that it's not currently burning up. Like, you'll hear my Australian accent and there's a kangaroo, and you'll know about the horrendous bushfires that we had over the last summer period. Where we lost 3 billion animals, and there was catastrophic impacts on supply chains across businesses. Employees couldn't get to work, things were shut down. So it's a threat multiplier, but it's also a threat multiplier for the UK. So you remember that hot summer that we had in 2018? Regardless of, and that changed the purchasing habits of different consumers. It meant that people couldn't get to work because there was a lot of disruptions there. Regardless of how much we emit in the future, by 2050, every second year will be like that. With climate change, hot gets hotter, dry gets drier, and wet gets wetter. So here in the UK, we will experience more floods, which will prevent people from going to work, it will disrupt supply chains. And so even in this lovely temperate climate that we have here in the UK, we will be affected. And it is on track to make the world uninsurable if we continue on current pathways. So the key takeout, it's a threat multiplier and the risks materialising today. Where are we going to go? Well, history is not a valid analogue for the future. You can no longer look in the rear vision mirror to assess what will happen in the future. We already have 1.1 degrees of warming, and that's given us the impacts we have today. We could hit 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures as the global average temperature rise as early as 2024. That would mean that 14% of the global population is subject to extreme heat. Extreme heat is when you hit over wet bulb temperatures and it's not, you can no longer be outside. 90% of our coral reefs will lose. And so what that will mean for tourism, for fisheries, and for all of the lives and livelihoods that depend on those industries. Sea levels will rise by 40 centimetres. So those of us who like living near the coast, that will mean a large change in the cost and availability of insurance, and also the flood defences that we will need. You can see the projections. Grey is where we are heading. Blue is if we actually implement current policies, and that's still 2.8 to 3.2 degrees. Where do we get with 2.8 to 3.2 degrees? Well, we will end up with drought over a large proportion of inhabited land, sea level rise, extinction of all these species. So it looks pretty horrendous, and every 0.1 of a degree temperature rise matters. There is a big difference between 1.5 and 2, and a very big difference between 2 and 4. But it gets a little bit more scary. We have these things called tipping points, and so they are high impact events that are non-linear and maybe abrupt and irreversible. Like the example is the melting of the Antarctic ice sheets. That won't continue in a linear fashion. We can actually hit these points that once they start melting, we will just get meters of sea level rise and we won't be able to reverse that. So scientists in the last couple of years have started to get very, raise the alarm and get a bit scared about tipping points. So when we talk about degrees of warming, when we talk about the impacts of climate change, we need to know that they are non-linear and they may be irreversible. We have solutions. We have decided, the world's governments have agreed to do something about this, and we have agreed to transition our economy away from the fossil fuel-based economy. We'll need to decarbonise, and that will create risks and opportunities in the transition. So, the international endgame, we call this the mother of all market symbols, the signals, the Paris Agreement. And so this, back in 2015, the world's governments, the leaders, you'll recall they got together in Paris over croissants, orange juice, nice espresso, and they agreed to a commitment on climate change to hold average increase in temperature rise to well below 2 degrees. That's not 2 degrees, that's well below 2 degrees, because remember, every 0.1 of a degree matters to the impacts that we will feel. They also have committed to take efforts to strive for 1.5 degrees, because when we looked at what 1.5 degrees looked like and 2 degrees, actually 2 degrees is so much worse than we thought. So they agreed back in 2015 to strive for 1.5 and to reach net zero emissions. And so that is a balance between the sources and human-induced sinks. So we have human-induced sinks are things like planting trees that store carbon. They take the emissions out of the atmosphere, but they need to be permanent and they need to lock it in the ground and keep it there and not be destroyed by fires. You also can have some pretty crazy technology that could have direct air capture. That might be something in the future. But we need to have net zero emissions. That's required by the physics, because we've realised that there is no safe degree of emissions. If we continue to emit, we will continue to get more warming. We will continue to get more climate change impacts. So the international endgame is the Paris Agreement. And we also have the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. One of those, Goal 13, is climate action. But a lot of those are impacted by climate. So the sustainable use of resource, production, consumption, life above land, life below water, etc. So we have the goalposts for business within which you must operate. And we have countries already implementing their promises. So here in the UK, we have a target in law to reach a net zero emissions economy by 2050. So how do we get there? Well, we need to go on a journey with our economy and the way in which we live and produce and consume. We no longer, or I no longer say energy transitions. Back in 2018, the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, it's like the gold standard for climate science, the UN group, they produced this special report on warming of 1.5 degrees, and they gave us this language of systems transitions. So in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals, we need systems transition. This is not just energy and carbon. This is systems. So it is land use, it's buildings, it's urban and infrastructure, it is the energy systems, industrial, transport. We need deep emissions reductions in all sectors. And so I've got a few 10 key solutions. And I'm not sure what kind of companies you work for. I can see a few faces in there, but this will impact on all businesses because it is that far-reaching in our economy. So that's the journey we need to go on. We've got some goalposts. We have and we have some solutions. In this transition, there will be winners and losers. There will be disruption and there will be resilience required. And so how do we think about, how do we assess what these transition risks and opportunities are? Well, the Bank of England has given us in their climate risk taxonomy some language around that. So when we're looking at transition risks and opportunities, we're looking at policy and regulatory shifts. So climate is not just carbon, but it is a carbon price. it is restrictions on carbon, ending fossil fuel subsidies. And so shifts in policy and regulation create risks and opportunities as society responds. There are also technological developments. And so these are like market forces, and they can collide with policy and regulatory shifts. Like, for example, electric vehicles. We have here in the UK currently a 2040 ban on the sale of internal combustion vehicles. So that's the gas guzzling cars that we all grew up with. They're talking, should it be 2035 or should it even be 2030 as they consult to see when they'll bring that back. So we have both the policy and regulatory change, but also in line with that, we have technological developments as batteries are cheaper and as we have the charging infrastructure to replace the internal combustion vehicles with electric vehicles. We also have shifts in stakeholder preferences, and these create risks and opportunities as they change the market dynamics. So equity investors, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, but we have equity investors saying, we care about climate risks, tell us about them, mitigate them, manage them. Debt markets, so the credit risk agencies like Standard & Poor's, so S&P Global, Moody's, they are starting to incorporate climate risk into their assessments. Insurers, they are on the front line, particularly of physical risks and also liability risks, and they are incorporating climate risk assessment into their pricing, the cost and availability of insurance. We also have the regulators get on board. And a key example of this is the NGFS. So that's the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a coalition of central banks and supervisors. I think we've got over 66 at the moment. So essentially all of the large G20 OECD economies plus, excluding the US, but they do have some of their, the CFTC are currently an observer on that. So they might end up entering that, but it is a global coalition of central banks and supervisors that say that climate is a financial risk issue, that they need to incorporate that into their supervisory mandate as they, for their monetary policy, their financial stability mandate. And so that has flow-on effects for their regulated entities, as well as the entities that borrow money or are invested in by investee companies for their regulated entities. We also have social preferences. So it is becoming quite an issue for oil and gas companies to recruit millennials. No one wants to work for an oil and gas company anymore. We also have consumer preferences for purchasing powers. And so that shift in stakeholder preferences changes where we spend money, how we spend money, what the supply and demand and revenue projections will be for entities. And we will find that markets will open up and markets will close down. So we'll need to be looking ahead to seeing these shifts and in the net zero transition so that your companies are not taken by surprise. So it's nice to talk about this transition being rapid and orderly, like we need it to be. But we've had the Paris Agreement for 5 years. We've known for much longer than 5 years that we do need to decarbonise. You would have been hearing that term for much, much longer. And so we have known this for a while, but we have delayed. And so the policy response, we're starting to talk now about a disorderly transition. And so this language is coming into the scenarios that our central banking regulators are talking about and asking regulated entities to test their resilience of their assets and liabilities and operations against. And we have the PRI. So this is the world's largest network for responsible investment. They have 80 trillion in assets under management. So they basically own everything. And they are talking about the response to climate being, there's an inevitable policy response, they say, and it's going to be forceful, abrupt, and disorderly because we have delayed. So in the next couple of years, around 2023 to 25, if things continue as they are, the climate impacts are just going to get worse. We are going to have these bushfires, wildfires we're seeing in the US, the horrendous storms that are increasing in frequency and magnitude. We are having the school strikers telling their parents, telling their grandparents, mum and dad, grandma and grandpa, I don't want to have children because I'm too scared about the climate futures, and we are going to act based on these stakeholder preferences. What will that look like? Well, actually, we think that the PRI says there might be coal phase-outs by as early as 2030 for first mover countries. What will that mean for companies that sell thermal and met coal, and also the industries that rely on those? Energy efficiency will increase, zero carbon power. The uptake of renewables will just increase out of sight. Sales bans, carbon pricing, at the moment it's quite low and it's not consistent with what we will need to meet our Paris goals. But some investors are actually already testing how their portfolio would align with a carbon price of up to $700 a tonne. So if you're not testing your company against those kinds of shadow carbon prices, then you might get caught out because your investors are starting to do so as well. So when we're talking about this transition, it would be great if it's rapid and orderly, but the longer we wait, the more disruptive and forceful it might be, and the more disruptive it will mean for you. So we'll need resilience, and we'll need to be looking ahead now. Okay, enough on transition risks. Let's move on to liability. And so this is something that we as lawyers all love, even if we're not litigators. When the courts get involved, because there's commercial loss, then that's an issue for us. So climate litigation is increasing across lots of jurisdictions, particularly the US. We now have over 1,500 cases worldwide. And so the red is how many cases are in the US. Australia is also a key ground for climate litigation. And as the climate policy is not so strong in the US and Australia, we have people turning to the courts to claim compensation for loss, to seek to change corporate and government behaviour, and to hold others accountable. What kinds of claims are they bringing? Well, it's across the gamut of commercial laws, environmental laws, human rights claims, tort, negligence, failure to warn, anything, you name it. It could be the facts and law relevant to climate change could be squeezed into anything. A way in which to think about your potential liability exposures to your business, and also liability exposures where you might face second or third order impacts, for example, through your clients, your customers, through credit risks, and also insurance liabilities. People are being sued, companies are being sued for a failure to mitigate, so they didn't prevent it. Essentially, they're causing climate change. And so that's the kind of carbon majors litigation that we're seeing in the US and elsewhere. Companies are being sued already, and increasingly will be sued for a failure to adapt. So it's where they have failed to manage the physical and the transition risks. And so that could be directors as well. We know it's a financial risk issue. We now have all of this data on the science. Investors, regulators, stakeholders are saying it's an issue. So if you are not taking this into account in your governance roles, then directors may be personally sued, or it could be that companies, those stock drop claims, we're starting to see them already in the US. So failure to adapt and failure to disclose as well. Essentially, climate litigation is open for business. The courts will decide on claims that are properly brought based on their merits, and people, as we have an increased loss associated with climate change, it's just going to be more court cases as people seek to shift those losses. Okay, now I'm kind of rushing through this, so I want to spend now a little bit of time. We've kind of set this up. We have a way to think about the physical risks and the economic consequences of those physical risks, what the climate science is telling us about what will happen in a jurisdiction, in a geography, across business fence lines. We now have a way of thinking around what society and stakeholders' responses will be to physical risks, to both prevent the worst climate change and also to respond to and have resilience in the way in which our economy is set up. And so we've got the transition risks and opportunities, and we also have liability risks, as the physical risks and the transition risks aren't measured, aren't mitigated, aren't reduced. Climate change will increasingly end up in the courts. And so we don't want liability to be the wrong kind of driver. We want it to be the driver now. We reduce those risks. So you've heard about the physical transition liability risks. So have your regulators and so have your investors. And so we are seeing a ratcheting of expectations of what investors and regulators expect of entities to identify, measure, mitigate, and manage these risks. And this is where I'm actually going to start to talk about impacts a little bit as well. First, let's stay on risks. And our two kind of key expectations that I'll talk about is we're going to talk about disclosure. And so disclosure here is driving measurement, mitigation, and management of risk. So what's get measured, what's get disclosed, gets managed. So these aren't disclosures for the sake of tell us about your climate-related financial risks and opportunities in your annual reports, tell us about them in the financial statements. It is to price capital, to shift from dirty to clean, to invest in the resilient infrastructure, companies, assets and operations for financial stability, and to make sure that our investors and regulators see that the right governance teams are in control of the capital. So how are they doing this? We have the TCFD. So you might have heard of this one. That's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. When the Bank of England PRA came up with that climate risk taxonomy, physical transition liability risk, that was Mark Carney's team, and he was also the head of the G20 Financial Stability Board at the time, back in 2015. So he set up a task force led by Michael Bloomberg, and they were tasked with coming up with clear, consistent, comparable recommendations, a framework for entities to be able to assess and disclose their climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And since it was released in 2017, it's essentially become the kind of expectation of how entities are expected to manage these. So if you're thinking, well, okay, what do I do? I would turn to the TCFD first. It is also becoming mandatory in the first mover jurisdictions, and the UK is one of those. So for premium listed issuers on the LSE, it should be from about March next year. They're consulting on rules, but it will be TCFD disclosures will be required, in which case if you have a premium listed issuer like a bank, then they'll need to know the information to be able to make their own disclosures. So this will trickle through to smaller companies as well. These recommendations cover governance, governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And one of the key things around strategy is scenario analysis. So it's saying because of what we've just learned, that historical events are not an analogue for the future, we need to do some scenario analysis, looking at plausible climate futures, plausible physical pathways, plausible transition pathways, to see how your business model and strategy will be impacted across different kinds of pathways for our warming world and society's responses to that. So it is a new way of thinking about risk for some. It's not a new way for thinking about risk for others. So the oil and gas industry have been doing this for a while with supply and demand, but now they need to do it for much more than oil price curves. So that's the front end. The back end of the report. Australia actually leads the way in accounting guidance, but we are starting to get there in other jurisdictions as well. What could I possibly, with an Australian accent, say with authority around climate change? Because we don't have, in Australia, don't even have a climate policy. We don't have a Climate Change Act, and our energy policy doesn't even take into account climate. It is mortifying. But our accounting standard setters lead the world in terms of connecting the dots between climate being a financial risk issue, as the central banks and regulators, the economic literature is telling us the world over, and what that means for the financial statements, which describe performance position based on financial risk, and it needs to, the assumptions underlying the accounting statements need to look at financial risk issues. So in May 2019, the Accounting and Audit Standards Boards released this guidance, and that's the guidance with the wave crashing over it. And this is on IFRS. Australia, like the UK, uses IFRS financial statements. And so it says that climate risk is not just an issue for the front end. You need to connect the front and the back end and consider how climate risks impact on the accounting estimates underlying the useful life of assets, impairments, onerous contract provisions. So the balance sheet items that are right for consideration. This also brings it within external audit scope as well. This Australian guidance was echoed by the IASB in November. They said it makes sense for financial statements, and just yesterday, IFRS the IASB Foundation has launched a sustainability working group as well to see if they need to do anything more on financial statements. So this should squarely be on your radar if you are not thinking about climate in terms of the numbers in your financial statements, which you as general counsels will be supporting your board to make sure that they, for their assurance for these both annual reports, the front end and the back end. Climate is an issue that should be taken into account in all of these governance and reporting requirements that have been around for as long as we have been thinking about modern companies and capital markets, but climate's an issue for them now. And the last thing on this one, we have the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. And so this is investors asking for these disclosures as well. They are asking for TCFD so that then they can align their portfolios with net zero transition pathways and reduce their risks to their portfolios as well. Two developments I just want to briefly touch on. I'm not going to go into detail, but I want to put these on your radar. The first one is the EU taxonomy. So this is essentially a green finance dictionary for the transition. The Commission is doing a lot to try and use the global nature of capital markets to progress both their own sustainable finance and the transition of their economy to meet their net zero goals, but also to have that long-arm jurisdictional reach because financial flows are global. So they've developed a taxonomy. How do we know what is consistent with the transition, what is green and clean? And so they have come up with this taxonomy. They've got 6 environmental objectives. And so your revenues, your capital expenditure, your portfolio, if you're an investor, can be taxonomy compliant. You know that it is meeting these environmental objectives if it contributes substantially to one or more of the environmental objectives. So it looks at an economic activity level. If it does no significant harm to any of the others, if it complies with some minimum social standards, this is definitely green, not sustainability more broadly, but there are some minimum thresholds and then also some technical screening criteria. And so this is a green finance dictionary. We've got the rules for climate change mitigation and adaptation across a bunch of different sectors. So is your portfolio, your company, your counterparties, are they spending money? Are they getting revenue from what we call the economic activities that are aligned with the transition? Look to the taxonomy for that. Also expect that you might be asked for reporting requirements in accordance with this. The other one to put on your radar is the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. So far I've been talking about risks to entities, which create risks to financial stability. This is the most direct impacts of. The EU non-financial disclosure regulation already has it a bit, but this is trying to get impacts of across the globe by placing obligations on EU financial market participants to disclose their principal adverse impacts. So this will be a very big, the EU is essentially saying we not only care about, with double materiality, we no longer just care about risks of, we care about impacts of as well. And so this is something to pop on your radar. It's actually it hasn't received nearly as much attention as it would so far, but principal adverse impacts, this list of 32, tick the box, tell us if you meet any of these, then you fail that criteria. I'm calling it fail. You have a principal adverse impact of your revenues, of your capex, of your investment portfolio. So this will be a big deal. Okay, so what does this mean for you? As general counsels, these financial risks and opportunities matter for your company's business strategy, for its governance, for its disclosures. So you will need to be supporting the board to make sure that they are fulfilling their duties in risk management oversight, in assuring their disclosures. So setting up these governance processes from the start so that you have the robust governance process to make sure that your company is resilient in the transition and that the disruptions, it will survive and thrive through these disruptions. That means incorporating climate change risks and opportunities into your business strategy and planning, and particularly scenario analysis will be really key for that. Climate risks will need to be taken into account in M&A and due diligence, and also your funding. And so thinking about when you are pricing and looking at legal risks in large M&A transactions, if everything that we know about the source of risks, how far in the breadth, magnitude and depth of climate risks to the economy and to entities, actors, assets and operations, then we'll need to be taking this into account in DD. Also in funding, can increasingly affect the cost of capital negatively, also positively as we look to green finance opportunities, both from green bonds, but they're so 2014, into sustainability linked loans. That's something that's very exciting and have accelerated from a standing start back in 2017. Now we have really interesting sustainability linked loans, your normal revolving credit facilities linked to bespoke targets that link with your strategy. You can reduce your cost of capital. Contracts and supply chains, and this is where we're starting to look to the Chancery Lane project, looking at risks from a legal perspective, thinking about counterparty risks, design specifications, what is GEOP or GOP, so the good engineering and operational practice in a warming world, what kind of standards do you have, changing law clauses when we think that it's looking like it's going to be so disruptive, force majeure, is that fit for purpose, but also could you create better climate risk sharing like with the TCFD, like with the Chancery Lane clauses we have. Finishing off, responding to these climate risks and opportunities is a journey without an end. It's more like occupational health and safety. You don't get to say tick the box. It's not a compliance activity. It is core to your strategy, and it will be key to whether you continue to survive and thrive. So the sooner that you incorporate this into your individual roles as general counsel, you will be able to add value as your companies transition and help with that really scary risk management and liability that is really key to your roles there. Getting on to something exciting, and this is just foreshadowing what Ben's going to talk about, the Chancery Lane project. This is the opportunity to, in a pro bono capacity, but to embed this in your businesses. So really exciting. We don't just care about risks, we also care about opportunities to be enablers of the transition within our business rather than just hindering it. I'm going to finish there. There's some contact details and I look forward to the discussion. Handing over to you, Ben, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm always very sobered by such presentations, and it's hard to follow something like that. I find the scale of what's coming, whether we like it or not, overwhelming, more overwhelming than the scale of information that Ellie's provided in a very short period of time. So I think it's always very good to stop for a minute after such a serious and sobering presentation. I would really encourage you all to reflect on what Ellie's just said This is being recorded and will be made available. I'd also encourage people to read in ways that they're comfortable with, or view in ways that they're comfortable with. I would point people towards the IPPR's report on environmental breakdown. I would point you to any video of more than 30 minutes by Professor Kevin Anderson, not the cricketer Kevin Anderson, the climate scientist Kevin Anderson. I would point you to last year's Economist special. If you're a bit more of an academic, then maybe the Grantham Centre at LSE or the Stockholm Resilience Centre websites. The more you can breathe this in and make it part of your somatic and lived experience, the more it will be relevant to your work, and the more you will see that there is nothing else other than to focus on this. So that's my pause and my invitation to you all. I'm going to share my screen and in maybe 3 or 4 minutes rattle through some of the basics of the Chancery Lane project, if I can actually find it. There we go. So I'm Sherpa Clark, administrator of the Chancery Lane project. It's a great privilege to work with lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. I say that at the start of most of these presentations. I just think lawyers are really cool and they're going to change the world. I get that because I see the great power that lawyers have when they take the pen, and the great responsibility that comes with that, set within the context of what Ellie just presented on. So what is the Chancery Lane Project, or TCLP as we lovingly call it? It's simple. It's a pro bono initiative that brings together legal professionals to collaborate and rewrite contracts and laws in order to support communities and businesses in fighting climate change and achieving net zero carbon emissions. I think climate change and net zero are our initial objectives. There are transitional objects, if you understand anything about psychology, to much bigger, more complex, ontological ways of being shifts. But right now it's climate change and net zero, and it is a remarkable experience. We have coming up for 300 active members of our Slack community, 115 law firms. Many of you on this call have engaged with us over the last 6 to 9 months. Our goals, if anybody knows this style, it's from Spinal Tap. We're a lot more serious than Spinal Tap, but serious doesn't mean somber. So we're trying to shift the dial and make climate conscious drafting that seems ambitious now the norm as quickly as possible. It's about new market norms, and you're going to be hearing that term from us more and more over the coming months. And we want to make consideration of climate risk mainstream, so it's no longer thought of as a discrete environmental issue. Simple, but a big task. We've got a core team, top left, Matt and Matilda, Ellie. I'm afraid the Wombat didn't make the recruitment grade. Myself, Jenny and Becky, 6 of us so far. But actually, the real people are you guys. You're the superheroes, the users and super users involved in the Chancery Lane project. You guys are the people that we're there to help and support. Take this subject matter to heart and drive it into every element of what you do in your day jobs. We have some resources for you. Last week, was it last week? It feels like it was an age ago. We launched the 3rd edition of our climate contract playbook at almost 250 pages. We have 50 clauses. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer. Don't ask me to comment on them. But essentially, they're starting to land into the precedent banks and standard contracts across regulators, across law firms, and across corporates. It's early stages, but the impact that we're making and the uptake that we're experiencing is remarkable. To aid that, we've also developed a glossary where we have 46 standardized definitions related to climate to support lawyers in getting their drafting spot on. And again, last week, we launched a new website. I should have blanked out that URL. Please don't record the URL. Sign up through Get Involved to engage with it. But we have a website where we're running all of our events now. We've started by initially by running individual events. We've had such an overwhelming interest from law firms and multinationals that we are We've standardized and codified our approach to drafting, placed it onto a website, got explanatory videos, worksheets, and all that kind of stuff, YouTube channel, etc. We're building it as we fly, but essentially we now have the resources to support pretty much all comers who want to engage and well, engage with the Chancery Lane project approach to collaborative drafting. Sneak preview of the website. On the left-hand side, you have a 7-module breakdown or menu related to the different elements of the work that we support you in doing. This big hack focuses in on the 5th and 6th of November, but effectively started last week. And we have 4 times weekly sessions currently throughout October, and actually November and December. Mondays 4 p.m. and Wednesdays 8 a.m. so that we can go all the way around the globe. We've got people from Melbourne, Sydney, Singapore, Dubai, various European countries, and the UK on those calls. Actually, I've done it the wrong way around. Mondays 4 p.m. is for the West, is out towards the States, and the mornings is out east. So community calls to build community, to support each other, to get to know each other, to understand the project. And Tuesdays and Thursdays, starting next week at 1 p.m, we have drop-in sessions where we will all work together to support you in whatever element of work you want to undertake within our events website. And then you have another screenshot of our super cool, fantastic events website. Wednesday mornings, aided by a colleague of Ellie's, Charlie Turner, forgetting her name, who is in Melbourne. We are building as we fly in collaboration with you guys. We're looking at the development of what we're calling integration, which is taking the existing 50 clauses and thinking about how they can be integrated into the precedent banks and contracts of law firms and corporates. It's rough and ready at the moment. We've had 3 remarkable sessions, hour-and-a-half long sessions of user-centered design and feedback. We've welcomed you guys to come along and get involved. As in-house, that's the natural place to start. However, if you can see my cursor, you might want to think about diving in at the shallow end with the beginnings of our process. Everything's on the website and is pretty simple in terms of understanding and engaging. So where are we? Well, we are where we hope you will be very shortly. We're on Slack. We are just about to go through 300 members, and we are on the events website of the Chancery Lane project. Please join us on both. That's where all of our activities are run from. One is sort of read-only consumption, the website, and one is interactive community, the Slack group. That's our URL. You need to sign up there, get involved, make a pro bono pledge. You will then get sent a link to join the Slack community. Come on in. The water is lovely. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Ben and Ellie. I've also put a link to the website in the chat, so you can just click on that and then it'll come up on the screen. We've got 4 minutes to go. That was thank you so much. It was a great overview of the Chancery Lane project and the risks we face and the businesses face today in relation to climate change. Do we have any questions?
Hi, Sarah. Sorry, I have a question. Radhika here. I echo Sarah's words. You know, thank you so much, Ellie and Ben. Your presentation, the importance of everything that you've mentioned, and you know, it was really touching to be amongst this presentation. And in fact, it's so nice to be amongst everyone else who's really passionate about this. I, like many others on this call, are passionate about this, but I'm not an environmental lawyer. So my question is, do I need to be an environmental lawyer? Do I need to have, read up about environmental law, etc., in order to be involved in the Chancery Lane project?
I would dive in immediately and say quite the opposite. You're perfect. Come on in. There is a smattering of environmental lawyers spread across the project, but the focus, in many ways, law and the environment have found the right point of leverage, but they're pushing in the wrong direction. So much activity is focused on environmental law, What the Chancery Lane project is doing, and some academics think it's a whole new doctrine, is pushing towards corporate and commercial integration of environmental considerations. It's not about being an environmental lawyer. Ellie, you're much more eloquent. You're the lawyer.
I don't even call myself an environmental lawyer, because for me, environmental law is like, I don't know what the environmental laws are. It's permitting, it's compliance. I've never studied it. I don't know what it is. I've never worked in it. I'm a commercial corporate lawyer, but I now have a specialty in this subject matter of climate and other environmental challenges. But squarely at its core, I'm a corporate lawyer. And so, yeah, I'm a little bit unique in that I've got this climate subject matter expertise, but that's what you can develop. What we really need is your underlying professional experience. So we need tax lawyers, we need IP lawyers, we need capital markets experts to bring their knowledge of where they're, what are the opportunities within the law that they do to break down barriers, to accelerate the transition. And so that's the expertise that we need. And then you can pick up the climate stuff, what's the environmental challenge we're working on. We need your commercial legal expertise. And that's what your businesses need too.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think where the Chancery Lane project is, there's the drafting piece, and then there's the integration piece. So that is plugging in the clauses that already exist into BAU contracts, and only corporate lawyers can really do that. And that's the purpose of the Zoom calls and the Slack channels, is to be able to discuss and raise any questions you've got. So if you're reading the documentation before you present it to your business and before you discuss internally, if you've got questions, Slack is the place to ask it. The Zoom calls are the place you go and say, I don't really understand, what's this for? Is there someone who can give me more background? Because obviously you need to be able to have a good understanding of what you're about to present internally to your stakeholders. And so that's how the whole thing comes together. But and that's what's so good about this. That's why I'm so enthusiastic also about the Chancery Lane project, is that it also brings together a community. So there's a whole dialogue to be had, so that you get a feel for the legislation and the risks that you need to understand before you discuss it with your stakeholders.
I'd also just add to that, I didn't explain that the Chancery Lane project's big hack, the 3 months of events that we're running will be based around themes. So we're spending the first month identifying and working up the themes. So themes that are currently clearly going to come through are financial institutions, construction, and insurance. So that speaks to corporate and commercial expertise, not environmental law expertise. Over.
Are there any other questions? So I see we're on the hour. No. So I'll wrap up here. Thank you so much. Thanks, Ben and Ellie, for your time. This has been really interesting. Please do click on the link in the chat and just find out more and see whether this is for you or not. But it's a really, I've been so impressed. It's such a great initiative, and the standard of the drafting is really high. The way it's come together, the way Ben has brought everyone together and made things, created a dialogue amongst law firms, in-house counsel, people of very different backgrounds, come together and discuss these topics and see how the market can really drive this change. So thank you all. I'll let you go back to our desks. And Ellie and Ben, thanks again. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for organising.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
The champion we need. Thanks, everyone. Join us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, I'll close it down.